My name's Monique Fischer, and I'm the Senior Photograph Conservator at NEDCC. And we're going to be talking about negatives today. From the earliest negatives that were made on paper to plastic negatives. So let's get started. In some ways, negatives are even more important than the photograph itself. You use it as a masters for multiple positive prints. A lot of them are fine silver particles embedded in a transparent layer, again, and the support can be paper, plastic, or glass. And there are different materials and there are different conservation problems. And a huge problem is usually the quantity of these materials. Lots of collections have a lot of acetate negatives and nitrate negatives, and we'll talk about these in detail. So I'm going to start with the first type of negative. It was a paper negative, and it's called the calotype. It was invented by Henry Fox Talbot in England in Laycock Abbey. And at that time, he was competing with Louis Daguerre, who created the daguerreotype. Some people say that the daguerreotype may be a dead-end process, and that Henry Fox Talbot is actually the father of modern photography. These had long exposure times. They were easy to transport, and you could develop them anytime after exposure. And since it is paper, the images weren't as fine as, say, on a daguerreotype, and so they would wax them to make shorter exposures and better prints. And here's an example of a calotype that I had made. I had taken a class and reproduced some old 19th century processes. And here's the positive salt print of that same negative. They're best stored in a cool environment and dry relative humidity. And you want to house them in sleeves and boxes and enclosures that have passed the PAT. And the PAT is the Photographic Activity Test. And if you go to the website of the Image Permanence Institute, they run this test, and it measures kind of the longevity of how well these enclosures will house photographs, negatives. The next type of negative was a collodion glass plate. From 1851 to 1885, this glass plate negative was invented by Frederick Scott Archer, and it helped actually produce a much sharper image and more detailed positive image. But the downside was that they were a wet plate. And so with the wet plate, you had to have a mobile darkroom. And I will show you in the next slide what that meant. Here you have a collodion binder. And how to identify these prints, you get a dull brownish gray color. And here is an example of a mobile darkroom. And you can see that the glass needed to be exposed and processed while it was still damp, with sensitizing chemistry to achieve optimum exposure speed. Here you needed the mobile darkroom, as you see in the upper left-hand corner, and on the bottom right is an example of Timothy Sullivan's sand dunes in the Carson Desert, Nevada. So when they're traveling out west, all the photographers had to carry with them their darkroom needs. And so you can see the complexity. So there was a transition time because there was an extreme inconvenience of exposing those wet plates and developing those wet plates. Then you have the gelatin dry plate negatives next. They were invented by Richard Leach Maddox, and he was the first to successfully make a gelatin dry plate negative in 1871. And here you see a gray or black image in color. And over time, great technical innovations were done. The exposures times were decreased, and ready-to-use light-sensitive plates were made. And this way you could shoot, you could put the dry plate away, then go back home to your darkroom, and then process the negative. So quickly, what's the difference between a collodion glass plate and a gelatin dry plate? As you can see, collodion glass plates were varnished. They are more stable, they have a longer density range, and they're handmade. So that way you'll see rough cut edges of the glass. And since the emulsion is poured, it does not usually cover the whole glass, so you see the pore lines. Whereas with the gelatin dry plates, they were rarely varnished, they tended to fade, they have less of a density range, and they were all machine made. The emulsions are cut edge to edge, and you have a clean cut glass. Storing these, again, in a cool environment, cool and dry environment, you want to use 4-flap enclosures, as you see in the image here, and you want to store glass vertically. And any kind of broken or flaking sink mats, because the emulsion does have a tendency to flake, you want to put them in sink mats. And here's a visual of what a sink mat is, and that's something you could, if you're handy or if you have volunteers that are handy, this is something you can do in-house. You want to use materials that have passed the photographic activities test, mat board, corrugated board, something that is sturdy to use. So the biggest problem are all the plastic-based negatives. How do you know what you have in your collection? And it's important to know what you have in your collection. So the biggest problem is identifying, and you can do this through dating of them, edge printing, deterioration characteristics, and testing, and we'll talk about all of these. Dating information, if you look at the chart and the handout that I gave you, cellulose nitrate, generally prior to 1920, you will know it's cellulose nitrate. Then you have that kind of mixed period between the 1930s and 1940s, where it could be either acetate or nitrate, but by that time they were phasing out the nitrate because of their flammability issues. And also later on, you have polyester film, kind of from the 1950s. And there's edge printing. If you look along the edges of negatives, you will see that some of them will say nitrate, some of them will say safety film, so that will give you a good identification of what type of film it is. And then there's also the deterioration characteristics, and I will talk a little bit about that in detail. And each type of film has a different type of deterioration characteristic. Nitrates will yellow and mirror. Acetic acid will come off the acetate film-based materials. I don't know if you've gone into your collections and opened up a box of acetate negatives. It smells like salad dressing. So that's a big giveaway. And acetate tends to shrink and be brittle. Let's pass this around, and this is a good example of acetate deterioration. And you can see the shrinkage of the acetate, and you can smell it. There's also chemical testing that you can do. I wouldn't recommend doing that, but because they are destructive and there are use of chemicals. But if you need to know, there are some tests you can do. There's a float test, a diphenylamine test, and the burn test, which will tell you it's nitrate. And I would use these as a last resort. The float test, you are using a toxic solvent, which is trichloroethylene, and it's really measuring the density of the film. You can cut off small pieces along the edges of the film. The cellulose nitrate will sink, whereas the cellulose acetate, which is actually lighter, will float to the top. Diphenylamine produces a blue intense color when it reacts with cellulose nitrate. And again, small samples can be used. The problems is it includes a false positive, and again, it's mainly tests that should be used by conservators. There is the burn test. Because cellulose nitrate is very flammable, it will self-extinguish itself, and when it does light up, it will produce a bright yellow flame and the sample will be consumed quickly. Cellulose acetate can also burn, but it fizzles out, so there's a different kind of burn. And you do need a sizable sample for this. You're really gonna cut into your negative, so I wouldn't recommend doing it. And so the issue is with the nitrate, as I said, it's self-extinguishing. So if you have a large collection in your a large collection of nitrate film, you should tell the fire department that they're there, because it's going to continue to burn. So at least then they have that knowledge that you have this flammable material on your campus or within your collection. So cellulose nitrate film negatives, it was early in 1889 that Hannibal Goodwin, an Episcopal priest, was motivated to search for a non-breakable and clear substance on which he could place images he utilized in his biblical teachings. In 1887, he retired from the church, and he actually had a patent that was created. But his patent was not granted until September 13th, 1898. And in the meantime, George Eastman had already started producing roll film. Again, it's flexible, it's lighter in support, and it really aided the rise in amateur photography. And here's an example just to show you a schematic of how cellulose nitrate is made from raw materials. You know, you're using cotton linters. And it's really the basis of manufacturing celluloid. Cellulose is modified with nitric acid in a process called nitration to create the nitrocellulose solid. So it's quite a large process. And as I said, it really aided the rise of amateur photography. Kodak had a camera. It says, you press the button and we do the rest. So people were now going around and shooting family outings, and they could send the camera back, and they would reload the camera with film and send you prints as well. So identification, I talked about edge printing, and if you see any dates from 1930s to the 1950s that say nitrate, there's also the V in the upper right corner, and I'll show you the notch code in the next slide. And we had talked about different deterioration characteristics and destructive tests. So here's the edge printing. This obviously tells you it's nitrate, who the manufacturer is. And in most cases, these notch codes in the upper right corner that you see, usually a V notch will tell you it's nitrate, but they did change over time. The V notch was more prevalent prior to 1950. Here's some examples of deterioration of cellulose nitrate. Again, they're very chemically unstable. They off-gas nitrogen oxides and forms nitric acids with moisture. They have more of an acrid odor, and usually the decay is irreversible. And you can see here, the nitrate does tend to get sticky, so they'll stick to each other and to their enclosures. There are different stages of deterioration. Stage 1, there's no deterioration, and there's usually a legible image. Stage 2, the film support turns yellow, and the image shows signs of mirroring. But here the image is still legible. Stage 3, the film does become sticky and gives off an acrid odor. Most of the image is still legible. Stage 4, the film becomes amber in color, begins to fade, and it's partially legible image. I think by the time you get to this stage, one needs to decide whether they're going to be put into cold storage or duplicated, and we'll talk about that later on. Stage 5, there's gelatin decomposition. The film is soft, and again adheres to adjacent negatives and enclosures. And stage 6, things can turn brown, become powdery, brittle, and break. We had talked about testing. So with the float test, again, they're destructive. It will sink. With the diphenylamine test, it turns completely blue. And with the burn test, you get that yellow flame and self-extinguishes. Cellulose acetate film negatives. With nitrate film, a lot of movie theaters burned down, hospitals, and so the companies needed to make a safer film. Doesn't mean it was a more stable film. So early cellulose acetate is from 1925 to 1950s. but well into the 1990s, and over time the formulation did change. Again, gelatin is the binder, and acetate is kind of a generic name. You can also say cellulose diacetate, cellulose triacetate. And like nitrate film, you can look at the edge printing. It says safety. Notch codes, U-shaped, were used generally from 1925 to 1949. And I can show you the different deterioration characteristics and destructive tests. Again, the edge printing. You see safety film, ANSCO, and the U-notch codes. And the main problem with cellulose acetate is the vinegar syndrome. And it does smell like a salad dressing. It's autocatalytic and moisture dependent. So if you store these negatives at a high relative humidity, the faster the deterioration is going to occur. They're not flammable, but they're also, as I said, chemically unstable. And again, there can be a stretch of time where the acetate negative may seem okay, but it gets to this point where you have this autocatalytic process, and when it reaches the acidity of 0.5, the process just goes much more quickly. And when you kind of get to that point, it's hard to stop it or to slow it down. So try to think preservation, cold storage, correct storage of these negatives will slow down any kind of these problems. Like with the nitrate negative, there's no deterioration in legible image at stage 1 deterioration. Stage 2, you do start to smell acetic acid. They start to shrink and become brittle, but you still have a legible image at this time. At stages 3 and 4, there's a curl that begins, and there may be blue and pink staining. The negative warps, but you do have a legible image. And with stage 5, you have bubbles form, crystalline deposits between the layers of the negative, and depending on the extent of damage, the image may or may not be visible. And so here's the example. And stage 6, the film base and gelatin are broken. The bond between the film base and gelatin are broken, and you start to have this channeling that occurs. And at this point, it's really hard to see the image. And when I say channeling, this is kind of the deterioration characteristic you see. And again, you have, the testing, and again, I would encourage you to have a conservator do this kind of testing. Float test, less dense, diphenylamine, you have a less intense blue, and with the burn test, there's a slow fizzle. So if you have a large collection, there are some survey tools out there that you can use, and I've brought them with me. You have the AD strips, the IPI storage guide for acetate film, and filmcare.org. Well, when you pass it around, you'll see there are different levels, and you can use it for sheet film too. They were using it for motion picture film. So you can compare the color of this strip. So 0 is fine, 1 starts to get iffy. Once you reach 1.52, you start to need to take action, either by duplicating it, or now it's digitizing the film, or putting it into cold storage. And as I'm passing around the AD strips, you'll see the pencil in there. And it's just a quick read to kind of give you an overall sense of the collection. And there's also the Image Permanent Institute Storage Guide for acetate film, which I would recommend. Again, it's an overall view of acetate film. And it also has this chart, and it really can tell you how long your film is going to, or how long it's going to take for your film to deteriorate, at different temperatures and different relative humidities. So to give you a sense, all right, let's start with something. So if you have already degrading film and you have an average relative humidity of 20% at say 35 degrees Celsius, it's going to last you another 350 years. So that's how effective cold storage is. If you had it at 80% and even at the same temperature, 35 degrees Fahrenheit, it's going to be 25 years. So humidity plays a crucial role in preserving these negatives. If you have to go to your boss and tell him or her that we need to buy a cold storage unit, these are good numbers to use. And the Image Permanence Institute also has a website called filmcare.org. It goes into a little more detail about all the different types of film formats, the different types of deterioration, and it also provides you with helping you create a database to keep track of your film collection. Because there is now kind of a trend where people just digitize negatives and then they get kind of thrown out. But I'm afraid that we're kind of losing our film heritage and kind of understanding the materiality of objects. And storage and care, cold environments for both cellulose, nitrate, and acetate. There's a standard for storage and handling of cellulose nitrate film, the National Fire Prevention Association. That is a good leaflet to have and an organization to join. Again, relative humidity needs to be stable, and temperatures can be from freezing to cool. Again, the colder the temperature, the better. You can buy frost-free refrigerators. Go to Sears and buy a frost-free refrigerator versus vaults. If you have a large collection, so something more than 150 cubic feet, and if you think it's going to grow beyond 10 household freezers. And polyester negatives, they're a little easier to deal with than nitrate and acetate. The binders, gelatin, they are chemically stable because it's a synthetic polymer and not a natural polymer like nitrate and acetate. And again, edge printing. Some will say polyester. There are non-destructive tests for this one. And you use a polarization filter, and it creates rainbow colors when viewed through two polarizing filters. So these are two polarizing filters, and then you put the polyester in between these two filters, and when the light comes through and you look at the edge, you will see a rainbow pattern appear, as you see in the bottom right here. And that will tell you it's polyester. That way you can just rehouse it in archival enclosures, and then you don't have to bother putting it into cold storage. So again, this is a good non-destructive test to determine polyester film. Polyester can be stored at room temperature, lower relative humidity. House negatives and sleeves in boxes and place on shelves or in a cabinet. And again, make sure they've passed the photographic activity test. So negatives are complicated. In some ways, they're more important than the print. They are the archival master in a collection. And as you can see, there are different problems, different conservation problems. The quantity and the accessibility make conservation very difficult, so you kind of need to look at the big picture with these things. And really what one should focus on is kind of permanent cold storage and digitization.